being heard there.
Oh yeah.
And then my kids play online with their cousins in New Mexico, and their aunt was commenting about how she's been hearing it. So everyone's very excited that I got batteries.
Everybody can rally behind it, huh? Okay.
Right.
I'm gonna go grab a cup of coffee off the Keurig. I'll be right back.
Enjoy.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Woke up this morning.
Better than the alternative.
Hey, Charlie.
You doing, Ryan?
Doing well. David?
Hi.
Good evening.
Good evening, everybody.
Hello.
Hi, Mayor.
Hello, man.
Is everybody getting their shots? Had them?
I got mine.
The interesting thing is how nervous people are about doing anything in public, even with the shots and meeting with people who have the shots. Everybody's sort of burned by the whole year.
Yeah.
We're not on open mic yet, are we?
You're not.
No, I just wanted to tell you, Ryan, I mean, the support I got from, am I getting the name right? Jamal
Yeah, the new outreach coordinator at the senior center.
I wouldn't have had the shots without her help. There's no way I could go to websites and navigate all that. She walked me through it. There would have been no registration, and then she helped me set up the appointment. And without that, I wouldn't have gotten the shots. You know, just going to this number and that phone number and just be referred to a website. It's like, thank you very much, but that. So it was all her doing. You know, I can't speak highly enough of her.
Well, it's really nice of you to say. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback about her, especially her, because she's been doing the lion's share of the assistance. So I appreciate passing on those sentiments, David, and I'll try to relay the message on your behalf.
David, if you could make that comment at a public meeting, you know, as part of the reports and comments of council members, that would be really nice.
It's so awesome to hear that, David. It's good to hear that we're doing a good job, and that particularly it's a difficult thing to walk people through. That it's working. That's really awesome news.
The people have different levels of need, for sure.
The thing is, you hear about other numbers you can call and other offices. I won't mention them, but turns out it's nothing but a link. You know, you're right back to navigating everything on your own. That's no help. What she does, that's help.
Who are we missing? I know I've got reasons for Alan and Ben. Who else?
We're missing Peter.
Peter. All right, but we do have a quorum, and it is 6:31. So I am going to call this work session special meeting of the town council to order. This is Wednesday, April 7th, 2021. This is a workshop. The rules of our workshops are that it is a special meeting. It complies with all the state rules around special meetings. But in our rules of procedure, it also says these workshops should be run more informally, and also that there will be no votes cast, with the single exception of going into executive session if we needed to do that. I don't believe there's anything on our agenda that would require that tonight. So I am going to dispense with last names and just call people by their first names, unless you object. I think we have a lot of work to do, and we should proceed. So, Sarah Ann, would you please call the roll?
Yes. Osberger,
Here.
Berthelot,
Here.
Bruder,
Here.
Bertoni,
Mr. Fertoni will not be able to join us tonight or tomorrow night.
Freudman,
Here.
Kotchenberger,
Here.
Moran,
Here,
Shurin,
Here.
Shaken.
Mr. Shaken will be joining us as soon as he's available. All
Thank
right.
you.
So the next item on our agenda is staff reports and communications. Is there anything beyond beyond Ryan's submission of the budget? Hearing nothing, we will proceed to the budget. I can't get over the habit. Ryan, you want to tell us about the budget this year?
Absolutely. To make sure that the screen share works here.
Mr. Shaken has just joined us.
Okay, everybody seeing that okay?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity to present my my budget recommendations for the FY 21-22 budget year. This has obviously been an interesting year. It's a challenge, I think, anytime a manager starts their tenure, his or her tenure, in the midst of, or really the beginning of the budget season. So really had to hit the ground running, starting basically within the first few days of my tenure. But it's also a great opportunity for a new manager to really learn a lot about the community it serves and its values, and really appreciate everybody's diligence along the way that has made this process successful up to this point. Some of the information I'll be sharing with the council, since this is a public presentation, is really for the audience at home, more so than you all. It'll be information that you're already familiar with, but I think it's important to provide that additional context. So without any further ado, now that there we go. So again, putting things in context, when we set about creating this year's budget, and when I set about personally crafting my budget recommendations that you're all receiving for the first time tonight, I really felt it important to link everything back and remind everyone of the guiding values and principles that are espoused in the Mansfield Tomorrow plan. This is, after all, really the vision document, if you will, for the town of Mansfield. And so the underpinnings of the values as stated in the plan are community resilience and sustainability, open space, agriculture and rural character, economic vitality, cultural offerings and amenities, multimodal transportation alternatives, sense of place and quality of life, financial stewardship and affordability, diversity, and high quality municipal services. Just a quick overview on sort of the governance of the town, so people can have, again, the right context of how municipal government runs or operates in Connecticut and more specifically the form of government here in Mansfield. So municipalities in Connecticut are creatures of the state. Powers of the town are set forth by statute and the state constitution. There's a longstanding tradition of local autonomy, however. Under Connecticut's Home Rule Act, towns are permitted to adopt their own local charter and choose their own structure of government. And as the slide shows, there are a wide range of municipal powers, from levying taxes to eminent domain and a wide swath of regulatory powers. In the state of Connecticut, there are three basic forms of government or options that municipalities can organize themselves by: selectman town meeting form of government, mayor council, and manager council. And obviously here in Mansfield, we have a manager council form of government. Article 4, however, specifies that it's town meeting that will approve a budget on an annual basis after the budgets are officially adopted by the town council. So while the council serves as a legislative body, or the legislative body for the most part, passage of the annual budget is something done by the town or the townsfolk at town meeting. The town council in this form serves as both the governing body and the primary legislative body, and the town manager is appointed by the town council and serves as the municipality's chief executive officer with a wide range of authorities and duties articulated in Article 5 of the charter. A quick thumbnail sketch of the town's organizational chart. All the operating departments flow from the town manager and overseen directly on a day-to-day basis by the town manager, but there are a wide range of both elected and appointed boards and committees. And also, I would be remiss not to point out that Mansfield being a little bit unique, we have a number of shared services shared with boards of education and other entities. And that includes finance, facilities, and information technology. I want to share what I see are some of the significant accomplishments in recent time. This is not an exhaustive list by any stretch, and I won't necessarily read every one, but I do want to point out some things, again, to put the work of the town in the broader context. Obviously, a huge amount of focus has been spent on responding to the COVID-19 pandemic over the past, well, going on 13 or 14 months now. And a special shout out to Rob Miller and his crew with the Eastern Highlands Health District for their diligence and constant flow of information and just a masterful job that they've been doing. Everything from sharing information to testing to ultimately administering vaccines, which is something people are really concerned about. We completed as a town a number of important recruitments, not only my position, but also filling the vacant finance director position, bringing in a new assessor, recruiting a new fire chief and an accountant. We are actively moving forward with the construction phase now. We completed design and pre-construction phases for the new elementary school. In the interest of transparency, accountability, and just promoting citizen engagement and responsiveness in government, we launched a new town electronic newsletter that's going out on a bi-monthly basis. We're in the throes of this now. It's not done, but continue to chug along with an extensive migration to a new financial management and accounting program. The system called Admins that we use now is incredibly outdated. It's a relic, and this migration is long overdue. But it's a Herculean effort being led by Charmaine and her staff in accounting in particular to make this happen. We obviously began offering meetings in an online digital format, again, due to COVID-19. And this has had the positive benefit of making a variety of committee meetings more accessible to the public. Some meetings logging as many as 100 participants, and then that's something that obviously wasn't happening in the pre-COVID days. We've been successful in administering a remote work system, although those days are largely behind us. But when COVID was at its zenith, adopting a remote work system and other modifications to operations to keep employees and the public safe. We've been increasing or adapting our offerings to our seniors in our community, particularly the senior center. Again, due to the pandemic and the inability to have the doors open to the public that we serve, a variety of adaptations being made to continue to provide core services to the public in a format that's public health friendly. And that contactless sort of means of service delivery extends obviously to pretty much every facet of our municipal operation. Land use, town clerk's office, the list goes on and on. We've performed an extensive amount of renovations to municipal facilities and the schools. When you hear from Alan Corson in subsequent days, Alan will provide you a pretty extensive overview of the work that's been done by our facilities department. Our library has been undergoing a wide range of accessibility improvements and obviously pivoting to an online programming format due to the pandemic. We've been trying to provide a wide range of support services to Mansfield businesses that have been feeling the effects of the pandemic. And a shout out certainly to Cynthia Van Zelm and our partners at the Downtown Partnership for all the work that they've been doing, not just in the downtown area, but throughout town, trying to stay in touch with businesses, keeping your nose to the grindstone and making sure that the members of our business community know that the town cares and we want to help in any way that we can. We obtained a couple small cities grants, CDBG grants, over $1.2 million in total. One of those grants is for a hybrid aerial pumper fire truck for Station 207. That request was for over $900,000. We didn't get the full request, but it was still well over $700,000, which is a significant amount of resources that we can deploy to eventually acquire and put said truck into service. And we're also very excited about a couple new resident assistance programs that we're offering with a $500,000 grant, both for childcare assistance and addressing food security for residents in low and moderate income levels that have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. We adopted significant changes to zoning regulations. We completed a townwide marketing guide with assistance from Advanced CT. We continue to pursue grant funding to support community development and open space initiatives. And our staff supported the Taste of Mansfield initiative to build awareness of Mansfield agriculture and promote the purchase of food from local farms. Looking ahead, challenges and opportunities that are on the horizon. We're not done with the pandemic. No, that doesn't surprise anybody. While it appears that the light, may be emerging at the end of the proverbial tunnel, we obviously need to keep our eye on the target and continue to do everything that we can to ensure that our community has a safe return to normalcy, and that it also requires us moving at the proper pace. We need to walk when we're not ready to run. We need to address aging and inadequate town buildings. This will be discussed more again in subsequent days when we delve a little bit more into capital requests. But I believe strongly that we have a number of buildings that are at somewhat of a crossroads in their history. They've served the town well in most cases up to this point, but there are physical limitations and other factors at play that may impact their ability to really effectively serve town needs moving forward. And so part of what you'll hear again in subsequent days is a discussion about a comprehensive needs assessment of many of our municipal buildings, and with an eye toward ultimately developing a municipal facilities master plan. The Mansfield Community Center, obviously the council has been, this has been an area of focus for the council and for the town's administration for a while now. There have been large chunks of meetings dedicated to discussing the finances of the community center and where do we go from here. Fortunately, we do appear to have some financial help on the horizon from the federal government that we'll talk about in a bit. But the reality is there still are a number of financial sustainability questions that hover over the community center and hovered over the community center before COVID-19 really gave it a shot to the gut. We want to continue to provide exceptional municipal services, and of course the $64 million question is how do we do that? But how do we do that in ways that are cost effective and ultimately end user friendly? Because we want our services to be accessible and responsive to the needs of our community. And how do we promote existing local businesses? How do we attract new forms of desired development? Again, these are all key questions that represent both a challenge and an opportunity. We need to keep up with our infrastructure needs, and we need to be ready to make the corresponding investments, capital improvement investments in order to do that, so that we don't fall behind and face, a huge deferred maintenance problem in the future. How do we provide affordable and workforce housing? Obviously, the town's in the process now of developing an affordable housing plan, working with an external party using grant dollars to do that. So how do we effectively make sure moving forward that our housing stock, that we have a diverse housing stock that meets the needs of all individuals that want to live in our community? How do we align department activities and actions in a strategic thinking manner as part of what I'll call pre-planning for the next master plan update? We're a little over halfway through the 10-year time frame that the Mansfield Tomorrow plan is intended to cover. So as we start to think about what will be the next 10-year plan, let's make sure that our department programs and services are in alignment with the goals and the broader aims of our community master plan. And we're very excited to be moving forward with the opening of the new elementary school that'll be on the site of the Southeast Elementary School campus. Excited about it being a net zero building and reflecting, again, the values of this community. As at least it's my understanding, it'll be the first net zero school in the state of Connecticut. Diversity and inclusion are really important to the residents of this town. So how do we ensure that our practices, and I mean that in the broadest sense, really all aspects of what we do as a municipal government reflect the core values of the town council, but also the community that we serve? And how do we promote productive working relationships with UConn? UConn, the fate, I've said this before and I'll say it again, the fate of UConn and the fate of the town are, frankly, inextricably entwined, that you can't separate the two. And so we need to figure out how do we identify and work on shared goals and navigate, have candid conversations, not always easy conversations around issues where we are in dispute right now. The budget. We want to preserve the quality of our current municipal programs and services. We want to continue on the tradition of the pay-as-you-go capital plan. We want to continue to grow our general fund balance with that 15% target in mind, and we want to minimize any associated increases in the mill rate and the overall tax burden to ensure that Mansfield is an affordable community for people to live in. We want to find efficiencies, again, in the broadest sense, from cost savings to improved access, digital means and other means for our residents for the services that they're looking to acquire. We want to promote transparency and accessibility. So think outreach and communications and making sure that people have easy ways of finding the information that they're looking for. And as I start off by saying, advancing the priorities and goals of the Mansfield Tomorrow plan. And of course, while doing all that, being ever mindful of the ongoing impacts, and particularly the economic impacts of the pandemic. So thank you for your indulgence on that front. I'm now going to get to the meat of the budget. So the operating budget, the expenditure budget that I am recommending is for a total in the general fund is for a total of $56,784,177. That's the sum total of the town of Mansfield Public Schools budget, as well as our annual contribution to Region 19. And it also includes I'll call it a hearty investment in our capital improvement program, which will be spelled out here a little bit more in subsequent slides. Types of revenue. Again, this is more for the audience at home. I know you as council members are familiar with these forms of revenue, but we receive, the local government is funded through taxes, through state aid, through licenses and permits, through charges for services, fines and forfeitures, miscellaneous revenues, and transfers in from other funds. The overwhelming majority, and unfortunately, it looks like it got lopped off here somehow. It's off the picture, but the large green area, about 2/3 of the overall operating budget, is taxes, and the next largest chunk is intergovernmental revenue at about 1/3, and that leaves "quote unquote" other revenue of about $800,000 at 2%. Other revenue being things like building permits, land use fees, revenue from the town clerk's office, and interest income on investments. This is just intended to show you, so that was basically, if I go back a slide, this is the breakdown, the percentage breakdown of this year's proposed budget. I wanted to give you a recent history. So this is 5 years, the current year, 3 past years, and then the proposed FY22 budget. And as you can see, that 2/3, 1/3-ish split between money raised from taxes and related sources and state aid is held relatively constant over that period of time. As far as tax dollars, this is showing you a breakdown of the current preliminary grand list. So we have just under $1.2 billion in taxable property, combination of real property, personal property, and motor vehicle. And the largest gains year over year in these figures is in personal property, which is up over 7.5%. All forms are up, but real property has been the slowest rate of increase, slightly under 2%. And for a net of just under 2.5% year over year increase in the value of our grand list, again, based on preliminary numbers. This shows a decade's worth of evolution or change in the value of the town's grand list. You can see 10 years ago in 2010 stood at $933 million, and today, as I just said, a little under $1.2 billion. If you fit a line to that graph, you would see a reasonably steady, albeit a relatively flat slope, but it is a steady increase. It's not oscillating up and down over time. It's been a steady ascent. This is basically just another way of giving you information that I already gave you. As far as intergovernmental revenue, payment in lieu of taxes for tax exempt property makes up a little under half of that. I believe it was, is around $8.2 million presently. The graphic that's in front of you shows, frankly, a not overly warm and fuzzy trend. The blue bar shows what our finance department has calculated under previous, or up till recently when the law was changed, what our annual pilot allotment could have been, which is 45% of the subject property's assessed value. But instead, we've been getting, in more recent years, closer to 20%. And so you can see that over time, and I'll hover over this, hopefully you'll see my cursor, the gap between the green bar and the blue bar, the green bar being the actual pilot payments we've received, and the blue bar again being the calculated ceiling of the pilot payment we could have received. that gap has grown over time, and the widening of that gap, that's not a good thing. The last time the town was fully funded in terms of pilot was 2001. So you're talking about going on 20 years.
Brian, can I ask a question about that graph, please?
Yes.
Does that include any of the other state funds, like the special?
Yeah, so it's two categories. I think we were looking for, I think it's called selects or select.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So it's the sum total. There's like a $5.5 million bucket and a $2.5 million bucket, and you combine them and you get the number on that graph. So as I alluded to, there've been some recent changes, like in the last month or so, changes in the pilot formula. This is changes in the authorizing legislation. I want to underscore that. That does not mean that state appropriations to fund pilot will be consistent with the authorizing legislation. That's been the problem in the past, is that what we've been authorized to receive and what we've actually received for appropriation have been different. But just to walk you through the changes, whereas before we had been, if it had been fully funded, we would have been eligible to receive 45% of assessed value. We would now be eligible to receive 50% of assessed value, because we would qualify under what the law refers to a tier 1 municipality. That's because our equalized net grand list per capita falls in less than $100,000. And so in our case, by our calculations, if fully funded, and just to, I guess, be a bit of a broken record here, that is a huge if, but if fully funded, Mansfield's annual pilot revenue would increase from just over $8 million to north of 21 million, a $13 million increase. And so obviously that would have pretty significant implications in terms of the dollars we would have to raise in property taxes on everybody else. Remains to be seen what ultimately happens with the appropriation process this year. And so I just want to say that all of the calculations I'm sharing with you tonight and we'll continue to discuss in the days ahead are based on the governor's proposed budget, which basically has the town's pilot revenue held flat. So none of the projections you're going to hear from me tonight incorporates this rosy outlook or possibility, but I want you to know that it is out there. And as I say in the slide, I'm going to emphasize or recommend the council continue to be pretty conservative in its own projections at this point. I also want to touch on American Rescue Plan, ARP or ARP dollars. This was the latest major federal stimulus package that was enacted. A lot of different, unknowns, frankly, still to be ironed out. I can't stress that enough. We have not received, we meaning all municipalities, are still waiting on Treasury Department guidance to really get more granular level explanations of what are eligible uses and how the funds will be dispersed and administered. But big picture, I can say that as it stands right now, and hopefully this won't change, but as it stands right now, the numbers being floated for the town of Mansfield are $2.5 million direct to the municipality. And this is where it's a little squishy, but we would receive our quote unquote prorated or per capita share of the Talon County funding, which is 29 million. I believe on a percentage basis in terms of what Mansfield's population represents of the overall Talon County population, that would put us in line for $5 million of the county fund. So you combine those two together, and that's $7.5 million. And that does not include, does not include monies that Mansfield Public Schools or Region 19 are in line to receive. That's sort of a separate track. So this is just town of Mansfield funds. Eligible uses. I know I shared this in a previous council meeting, but I'll repeat it here. Eligible uses broadly construed based on the language of the bill. We can use the monies to plug revenue holes associated with COVID-19, using, in our case, basically the FY 19-20 budget year as the baseline year for which we could compare any revenue losses in the current year's budget, the 2021 budget, or the next year's budget, the budget that we're talking about tonight, the FY 21-22 budget. We can use the funds to cover increased expenditures and mitigate economic harm from the pandemic. And that includes, this is what needs to be ironed out in the Treasury guidance. But it seems like the leading theories is that that's a pretty broad area and could include direct assistance to local businesses or other private sector entities. It also includes the ability to make investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. The funds cannot be used, however, just to lower the tax rate or to grow unassigned fund balance. So you can't just put the money in the bank. You have to demonstrate how COVID impacted revenue in a specific way in recent past and show from one year to the next what that drop off was in order to be eligible to use the funds for that. We'll talk about each of these individually, but these are sort of broad categories of phenomena that are driving increases in the budget. Just a quick thumbnail breakdown of general fund expenditures and what goes where. About 42% of the overall budget is allotted to Mansfield Public Schools. 20% of the budget is our contribution to Region 19, and the rest is the municipal government. Looking at each entity, if you will, the trio of entities that are making up the general fund budget. The town's budget is a slightly over $1 million year-over-year increase, and I'll break all that out here in a minute too, so you can see what's driving that. The Mansfield Public Schools budget is a 2.3% increase, and Region 19 a 1.2% for a net or a blended increase of 3.2%, bringing the current year's general fund operating budget from just over $55 million to $56 million, roughly $800,000. I do want to point out, though, before I move on here, that, and again, we'll talk about this more in subsequent slides, but if you looked at just the portion of the town's operating budget that is quote unquote operating or sort of non-obligated or discretionary appropriations, it's only about a 1% increase year over year. The lion's share of the increase in the town's budget is being driven by contractually obligated increases and capital investment that we'll talk about here in a moment. So breaking down the things that are driving an increase in the budget that are quote unquote obligatory or non-discretionary. These I just mentioned are pay-as-you-go capital in order to keep pace with project needs. This year's contribution to capital is over $400,000 more than last year's, and so that alone is a pretty significant hit. But the sum total of all the things on this list, including significant increases in our health insurance premiums and again, other contractual increases such as step increases and meeting our collective bargaining agreements, represents a 5.8% or roughly $1.2 million increase year over year. That's the stuff that we don't have a lot of control over, is basically the way to put it, which means that if you set that aside, I just got done showing you a moment ago that the year over year increase in the town's budget is just over $1 million. And so when you take into account that $1.2 million of increase is being driven by these things we don't have much control over, it shows you that the things that we do have some control over, we're actually being pretty responsible stewards of the taxpayer dollars by having that combined total come in at about $100,000 less. townwide expenditures, of which, you know, many of the bigger ticket items here are listed, the medical insurance, municipal MERS, the municipal employee retirement system, unemployment compensation, et cetera. And again, these are the biggest drivers that are listed here. Collectively, they represent 18% of the overall general fund budget. And so these increases, this, you know, handful of things is leading to an increase in those categories of just under $400,000. And that is, so of the just over $1 million increase year over year that I described, 36% of that increase is coming just from this very small handful of things. So again, a municipal budget there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of layers of the onion and a lot of object codes and line items. But at the same time, it's important for you all to have the context to know that while $1 million increase is nothing to sneeze at, it's important for you to know that 36% of that increase is directly attributable to just a few items here. I'm not going to get into huge detail with the Mansfield Public Schools budget because you'll be hearing more about that as this month continues, and I believe you'll be hearing directly from Superintendent Lyman. But this year's budget is slightly over $500,000 or 2.3% above last year's budget, and the driving factors in the increase are laid out in these handful of items here. Fund balance. Our general fund balance, I don't think I've mentioned yet, so I should mention it now. My budget does not include an appropriation or a transfer to fund balance. So there, unlike this current year's budget, where I believe $128,000 was raised specifically to grow fund balance, I'm proposing, I guess I'll use lay terms here, letting it ride in FY22. And when I say let it ride, I mean not raising more in taxes to feed fund balance. I think the town's fund balance, frankly, while it's a little bit below the target as set by the council of 15%, if you go back to 2007 and follow the trajectory it's been on, it's been improving and improving steadily, and it's in a very healthy range, I believe, at present. It's over 14%, so it's knocking on the door of the 15% goal. And I want to say that obviously we can still increase the value and increase even the percentage of our fund balance this year. And when I say this year, I mean this coming budget year. Even if we don't budget to grow the fund balance, this can still be achieved if actual revenues come in a bit above budgeted revenues, and if actual expenditures come in a bit under budgeted expenditures. So this does not mean that we will not grow fund balance. It just means we are not budgeting specifically to grow the fund balance. This is a thumbnail showing 5 years worth of data on salaries and benefits. As you can see, I'll touch on the blue bar here, salaries momentarily. Pretty sizable increase from FY20 to FY21. And essentially that boils down to, as you all know, there were a number of new positions, and in particular new full-time positions that were authorized to be added in the current budget year. And those positions have been advertised and filled. And so that, not surprisingly, does lead to an increase in salary expenses. But it's also why the increase in expense for salaries is much smaller as we transition from 21 to 22, because we're not adding any positions this year. So last year's increase was somewhat unusual because there were a number of additional positions added. Not the case in the FY22 proposed budget. Debt service. Our debt service load, based on everything I know to be a financial best practice for municipalities. I don't know how familiar the council is with some of the GFOA principles and some of the again, best practices that are promoted at the state and national level, but a range that I've been familiar with and always been told is a healthy range is somewhere between, or definitely no more than 10%, but often between 7 and 10% of your overall operating budget being debt service. And right now, obviously things are subject to change over time, but even though there's been a noteworthy uptick from FY 1920 to FY 2021, and I believe that's largely, it could be Four Corners sewer project, could also be the middle school roof. But even though that increase, again, that substantial increase has occurred, and we're now just north of $700,000, as an overall percentage of the town's operating budget, it's under 5%. So it's in what I think objectively, empirically would be called a healthy range. That doesn't mean we're looking to add substantially to it. Doesn't mean we're trying to double it to get to closer to 10%. Don't take what I'm saying that way. But even with this noteworthy increase from FY 1920 to 2021, we're still well within what financial municipal finance experts would say is a healthy range. Quick snapshot of the CIP projects for this year. And again, it looks like anything that's on the lower left of these graphics has a tendency to be cut off. So what you don't see here, doesn't appear you're seeing anyway, is between 1.7 and 1.8 million dollars in public works projects. This blue piece of the pie here is public works, and so I told John, only because we had John Carrington Day in the last few months, he gets a pass. He can come in a little bit higher this year. But the next largest wedge is facilities at just over 1.25 million, and then rounding out the rest are relatively small dollar things in the categories of community development, general government, community services, and education technology. In terms of sources of funding for our capital program, this year's my proposed general fund contribution is $2.38 million, and that's what's up, over $400,000 from last year. We won't get into it tonight with tonight's presentation, but I welcome an opportunity to have more of a philosophical conversation with the council about this, because one of the things that I find interesting about the way capital has been funded by Mansfield in the past is I'm more familiar with a model where your contribution to capital, and when I say contribution to capital, I mean specifically the amount that's raised and appropriated from taxes, is usually on a steady ascent year over year. Even if the amount you're expending may go up, may go down, may oscillate a bit depending on what the project needs are for that year. The amount you appropriate to CIP, again, in the communities I've served in the past, in a model that I think works pretty well, is to actually have it on a pretty sort of predictable rate of increase. So you basically can build in an annual escalator. So the year after year, your contribution to capital, again, goes up by that sort of consistent, predictable amount. That hasn't been the case in Mansfield. We've had sort of boom and bust years. If it was a year with heavy capital needs, the amount raised in taxes went way up. If it was a lighter year, the amount contributed from the tax rate went down. And so that peak and valley approach, I think, it generates some challenges and potentially some problems that I think we should maybe talk about more moving forward. But this year's proposed contribution is $2.38 million. The rest of the money, which again, this is stuff you've seen year in, year out, but a portion of the user fees, the ambulance revenue goes to fund capital. In a more typical year, that number would be about $400,000. We're budgeting $300,000 this year because we've seen ambulance revenue drop off considerably in the past year. Perhaps that will rebound in the post-COVID era, but we definitely saw a substantial drop off this year. And so rather than budget for $400,000 coming off a year where we came in, or will likely come in 75% of that, right now we're budgeting a number more consistent with what our actuals appear to be looking like for FY21. And the proposed usage of the funds, about $3.14 million will again fund capital needs. We'll fund the capital, the CNR. This is a breakout of what I was just alluding to. So it's basically slightly over $3.7 million in capital projects. The CNR will fund $3.14 million of that, or about 84%. And this shows you the other sources of funding for the projects being proposed this year. You've seen this in the pie chart already, but this is basically a tabular way of saying the same thing, showing what different departments and functional areas well, I should say being allocated, but what's been included or programmed in the proposed budget. Just a quick flyover of some of the projects being funded in each of these areas. We'll obviously have an opportunity to go into more detail in future days, but just to give you again that quick flyover. Public Works, a little over $1.7 million, the lion's share of which is road drainage and road resurfacing projects. In terms of facilities, a wide array of projects totaling about 1.25 million. But I do want to note, and I actually meant to note this before, and this has now reminded me, that so $382,000, which is a combination of two different projects, $382,000 of this year's capital budget is project work for Mansfield Public Schools. So that's not a number that the public schools carry in their budget. That's a number that we, the town, carry in our budget on behalf of the school, because the town owns all of the buildings that comprise Mansfield Public Schools. Public safety, the biggest ticket item here is $170,000 for the Quint fire apparatus, the aerial pumper truck, I should say. And that's again just to cover the shortfall in the amount that was requested from the CDBG grant and the amount that we actually were awarded. I continue to hear rumors that perhaps through other sources of funding, we may be able to offset more, if not all, of that $170,000. But I haven't seen anything concrete yet, and so we continue to include that shortfall in the capital improvement plan. I'll be very happy to pull it out if and when we get confirmation that there are other sources of state funds, so we don't have to use local funds for that purpose. I mentioned at the last town council meeting that I wanted to put some money in the budget to work on an as-needed basis with consulting firm that has expertise in strategic planning. So there's a little bit of money in there. This is a small fraction of what sort of investment would be needed if an outside firm was really leading the development of these plans. As I said at the last meeting, and I'll reiterate here, my vision is that department heads will produce the lion's share of these important work products in-house, and so we'll be using consulting services, in a much more light sense. And then various and sundry projects being funded through community services, invasive species control and park improvements, upgrades to our fitness equipment, and that's funded by the Parks and Recreation Fund, not the CNR, and playscapes and playground resurfacing. And community development. So this has been sort of a continuation of recent initiatives that have been underway, gateway signage, and further development and implementation of the marketing plan that Cynthia Van Zalm in particular has been leading the charge on. So this is when we get into the part that folks are usually most interested in, most curious about. So I have two versions of this slide. This slide assumes that there are no offsetting funds from the American Rescue Plan, ARP, that are being used to supplement categories of revenue that, again, we're budgeting is being down from one year to the next. So what I mean by that is, while a lot of the revenue shortfalls that the town has experienced are real and significant, so thinking of the community center as an example, that doesn't have direct tax implications because that's funded from a separate fund, from the recreation program fund. So an example of something that could have an impact on the tax rate if we use American Rescue Plan money would be backfilling projected reductions in our investment income. A year ago, we brought in about $400,000 in investment or interest income. This year, we're projecting $50,000. So that alone is a $350,000 drop. And as I understand it, as I've read the guidelines, but we're waiting confirmation of this, I believe that that's an eligible revenue that we can recover. But for the purposes of this slide, this is sort of playing it straight up, if you will. Does not use any or make an assumption of the use of any rescue plan funds. And so the projected tax rate for the budget that I've just walked you through would require a mill rate of $32.17. That represents a 0.79 increase over the current adopted mill rate of $31.38, or a roughly 2.5% increase in the mill rate. That would be for a resident with a home valued at the median level, which is currently $158,200. That would be an annual increase of $125 in taxes, which works out to about $10.42 a month. So again, that's the projection without using or assuming the use of any rescue plan funds to mitigate any losses in revenue from one year to the next. If we allow ourselves to think that we will be able to use rescue plan dollars to offset, and I'll just use that one category for right now, that $350,000 in interest income. If we were able to backfill that with rescue plan dollars, the projected mill rate would be $31.87, slightly under a half a mil increase, and slightly above a 1.5% increase in the rate. And that would be, again, for a resident with a home valued at the median level of $158,200, a $78 increase in their annual tax obligation, or $6.50 a month. A quick breakdown, if you know, to go back 2 slides, you saw that the total tax burden with the scenario where we're not using any rescue plan dollars, the total taxes due on this hypothetical median valued home that I talked about is $5,089. So fast forward, where do each of that individual's $5,089 tax dollars go? Just under 62% would go to education, combination of Mansfield Public Schools and Region 19, and then under 10% scattered across the rest of the functional areas of town government, public safety, public works, general government, etc. These are, and I believe you've seen this, this collection of towns, I think, is the same collection of towns that is often used for comparison purposes. So our projected mill rate, without any rescue plan dollars assumed, of $32.17 is about $5.50 per thousand under the average mill rate for quote unquote comparable towns that you see on this list. quick summary of what I've presented and what you'll read about in more detail when the complete budget book is circulated to you all. The proposed budget funds municipal services at current levels, and then as the second bullet says, it does not propose the creation of any new full-time positions. However, we are feeling some budget impacts this year, additional budget impact this year just from positions that were created last year. So what do I mean by that? I mean that it's not just a matter of continuing to pay wages to those new employees at the same level we paid them last year, but if it was a position that was added halfway through the year and we knew we were adding it halfway through the year, so we only budgeted for half a year's salary, we are now budgeting for a full year's salary. And so that sort of mandated hardwired increase is being passed on to this year. And we also have had staff, as you all know, John Carrington, the DPW director, was serving as the acting town manager. The town's assistant engineer, Derek, was serving as the acting DPW director. So now with the permanent town manager back in place, that game of musical chairs, people going back to their previous positions, that's a net increase in wages because you have essentially now all the positions that are part of your org chart filled again. And so there's going to be a natural increase in wages next year as a result of that, because last year the budget was formulated based on the understanding that there would be an interim in place, and so there would be that savings. Other highlights: the budget as presented meets the contractual non-discretionary obligations that the town has, and that's in the broadest sense. That's meeting CBA commitments. That's meeting multi-year contracts that the town has with vendors, all the above. It continues the model of the pay-as-you-go capital improvement program. And this year, as I've said now several times, we have a heightened level of investment, a substantial increase in the amount of capital investment this year relative to last year. And the sum total of all this, it imparts a relatively, what I'll call a relatively modest increase in the mill rate, somewhere around 3/4 of a mill under a more conservative projection, and under a half a mill if we allow ourselves to think that some of the rescue plan monies can be used to offset revenue deficits from this past year. This budget is a starting point. I know we're going to have many meetings throughout the month. I know there's going to be a lot of thoughtful back and forth, and I look forward to that rich exchange of ideas. And I look forward to reaching a budget that is as close to a consensus document as possible. A few notes on upcoming work sessions. These will continue to be done in a digital format, at least through April 20th, when the governor's current slate of executive powers, or the allowance, I should say, for towns to administer such meetings via virtual conference is set to expire. So we don't know at this point if that's going to be extended or not. This is the budget calendar looking forward. We have another meeting tomorrow night. And I want to end with a note of, real appreciation. Without getting too sappy here, we've had, the budget process is always, I think, a lot of effort, a lot of individuals, a lot of effort, a lot of behind the scenes number crunching, report generating, stuff that, frankly, a lot of people would be all too happy to shy away from. But it's real serious business, and it's incredibly important. And I believe very much that what's often said, that your annual budget is, the most important policy document the town has. It's a reflection of values. When you say you're going to fund something, when you lay out a suite of programs and services you're going to fund, projects you're going to fund, you're sending the message that this is what we value most. We're very serious about proper stewardship of taxpayer dollars. So every time you take a dollar from a taxpayer and you invest it in something, you better really believe in what you're doing. And with all that said, there's been a lot that particularly members of our finance team have been through. Personal loss, short staffing, competing demands, changes in leadership, a new town manager, a new finance director. There's been a lot thrown at a small core group of folks that, again, have been working tirelessly behind the scenes to help pull all this together. So on a personal note, I just want to say that, while I know that I can be I can be a contributing factor to people's stress level because I'm asking a lot, and I'm asking for a lot in a relatively short period of time to turn things around. With all my heart, I really do appreciate everything that our staff team in finance and all the department heads have done to help bring the budget process to where we are today. And it's been enjoyable working with everybody, and look forward to the rest of the process.
Thank you, Ryan. This is always one of the most interesting times of the year for us because I agree with you on the role the budget plays. I always say that the money is the lifeblood of the organization, and if you don't follow the money in the most direct terms, you have no idea what anybody is doing. So we really looking forward to this process is not exactly what people do, but it is clearly one of the most important things that we do as council members. Does the members of the council have questions to ask of Ryan or the staff? Ben?
I'm not sure there's an answer to this question yet, but I'm curious around the American Rescue Plan, a few things. One is, I know the funding has a sort of end date that we're required to spend it of 2024, obviously provided that Congress doesn't, or the president doesn't extend that date outwards, which is perhaps a likely scenario. So we wouldn't obviously be looking to spend $7.5 million in the next fiscal year, nor could we. But I'm wondering specifically around the question of the provision in the legislation that does not allow a municipality to use the funds to reduce the mill rate, whether the scenario that you presented, which I think reduced the mill rate by a tiny bit, would be allowable. Such you expended the money in an allowable way, but that caused you to reduce your budget by so much that your mill rate was reduced. Is that permissible or not?
So it's an open question, and that's why I guess I keep hedging, saying let's not necessarily assume that for sure that we can do this. But based on a number of meetings I've been a part of, including most recently, just in the last couple of days, another CCM meeting where outside speakers and subject matter experts are brought in to talk about this stuff. It seems, is the best I can put it now, it seems that would be eligible because you are covering a quantifiable demonstrated drop in revenue. And while it does have tax rate implications, it's not that you can't use the money in a way that would reduce the tax rate. You just can't use the money to reduce the tax rate. So if we were in the boat, let's say, of being able to not demonstrate the least bit of COVID hardship because every category of revenue did exactly what it did in the previous year. If we were somehow a town unlike any other that saw no impact from COVID, and by population and the formulas that are being used, we were going to get, to your point, $7.5 million. We couldn't just use that to basically give our taxpayers a break and reduce the tax rate, by some substantial amount for a year just to kind of have a tax holiday. But we do have the ability in our case here, using that one bucket as an example, to show that the markets, the interest rates really did take a dive over the past year, and there seems to be enough of based on what conversations I heard, and this question specifically being brought up at a recent CCM meeting, folks seem optimistic that there's enough of a causal link there, to say that it qualifies. So it's open question, but I'm feeling better and better about the prospects.
And then
Ben, you had a couple of questions. Are you done?
I just had a second question about the ARP. When are you expecting A, the money, and B, the guidance from the federal government that can, I'm sort of wondering, obviously, as we sit on April 7th for a budget that begins on July 1st, we don't have the details, but we have time to figure them out. And I'm wondering if we are expecting to have enough information where we could have everything figured out, including some sort of expenditure plan that's outside of this budget process, sketched out by the time we would need to adopt this budget.
Great question. What I can say is that if the goal, if the intent of the council, and I know this is an open question that you all will have a chance to deliberate on here in well, as early as next Monday's business meeting. If the council is intent on holding its town meeting on the charter prescribed date of May 11th, I can say with a very high degree of certainty that we will not have the answers to these questions. We might know more, we might feel better about assumptions, but early May, based on what has been said over the last few days and frankly leading up to this point, it sounds to me like early May is probably about the earliest we might expect to see anything from the Treasury Department. So we're talking about another 30 days before those guidelines are issued. So that doesn't really give you time to act on that. As far as when the monies are coming, my understanding is that the monies are going to come in two tranches. The first tranche, I believe it's the clock starts, and I might even have the notes here somewhere, but I want to say it's like 30 days. So here we go. Actually, do. So non-entitlement communities, which we fall in that category. We're under 50,000. Non-entitlement communities, we are statutorily required to receive our funds from the state. So the Treasury won't issue the funds directly to us. The way they will for the entitlement communities, they'll send it to the state. The state serves as a pass-through, and the state has to get the monies to the non-entitlement communities 30 days after they receive it. So we won't know when that is until it happens, and then the clock on no more than 30 days from that date. Doesn't mean it will be 30 days, could be less, but no more than 30 days from the time the state receives the funds from the Treasury. So that's the first tranche, and then the second tranche, again, as I understand it, is 1 year from basically the anniversary date of the first tranche, so the first half. You can expect to receive the second. So basically, 50% of the funding within 30 days of the state receiving it from the Treasury, and then effectively 1 calendar year later, the second wave.
Thank you.
Peter, followed by Terry.
My question got answered. Thank you.
Peter?
Thank you. Ryan, just one thing, when we talked about the general fund balance, you had mentioned what the general range is and where we were. And I wasn't sure, could you just go over that quickly again? I wasn't sure where, I thought we were lower than 5%, but not sure I'm clear on what the basis is.
Yeah, so and that's a good eye, Peter, because I would struggle mightily trying to articulate this in a clear way on the fly, and perhaps Charmaine and I can put our heads together and come up with a clear, crisp way of explaining it in a subsequent meeting. But basically, the percentage. So the way I'll put it is this: there are a few different ways that you can calculate or report your fund balance, and one way is to take your when you say, if you have a certain amount of unassigned fund balance, a certain dollar amount, the percentage that represents depends on whether you take that number and the denominator, the coming budget year, the current budget year, or the budget year you ended when you sort of certified that amount. And so the percentage, if you think about budgets as tending to go up a little bit each year, the percentage then that if the dollar amount doesn't change, the percentage that represents would be different depending on kind of which of those 3 years you choose to use as your denominator. And so, we've chosen to use the year that we're using here, and so that's why it comes out with the percentages it does. But the reason why the percentage, even if the dollar amount, which is shown in the graph to be level, because we're not budgeting for an increase in the fund balance, if the actual dollar amount remained level from the end of FY21 to the end of FY22, because hypothetically our budgeted expenditures married up exactly with actual expenditures, and our budgeted revenues married up exactly with actual revenues. If those two things happened and we really grew the fund balance, not a dollar, the percentage of the budget that represents would still go down, because as I just got done telling you, the overall budget's going up a few percent. And so that same dollar amount divided by a slightly larger denominator would mean the percentage would drop ever so little. And in this case, I think on that graphic, it went from 14.9% to 14.4%. So about a 0.5% drop.
Thanks. No, that's helpful. And also just related to that, when you were talking about, there's a, I'm sorry, this wasn't the fund, but that was one question. The second question was on overall general debt obligations. And you said, you were saying, I think a healthy range is 2 to 7%, and we're at 5.
I would say healthy range. Well, you'll see a lot of towns that have like a debt policy will, just like we have I guess we don't technically have a policy, but a lot of towns also have an undesignated fund policy. And it might say our target is this amount, but our healthy range is from here to here. What I was saying is that 7 to 10% is often considered to be a healthy range. No more than 10%.
Of
So the if you take your total debt load and you divide that by your overall operating budget,
okay.
what percentage is that? So in this case, it's like 700,000 divided by 56 million.
Okay.
What percentage is that? And that you don't want that percentage to be above 10%. And if it's less than 5%, you're doing quite well. That was the point I was making.
Okay. Thank you for both of those clarifications.
David?
Yeah, I don't know if these are more questions or comments. I'll try to pose them as questions the way I think the mayor requested. But on what grounds, how are we justifying going to 7 to 10% debt? This is a matter of philosophy. There are some of us who feel the best debt service is zero. I'm alarmed by the fact that debt service was only 275,000 2 fiscal years back. Now it's up to 700,000. I saw that it's not going up a lot now, but in 4 years it'll be 2.7 million, I estimate, once the debt service for the new elementary school and the middle school roof and solar panels kicks in. Now you're saying, no, 7 to 10% is okay. That seems to rationalize having a debt load of $5.5 million. And I don't know. I mean, you've said a couple of times during the meeting that you felt this was a consensus thing, the budget. It may be consensus among the 6 members of the majority Democratic caucus. I don't know. They can speak for themselves.
No political comments right now.
It's not a consensus among the entire council.
David, please, no political comments now. These are questions about the budget. I would also comment that all of that debt service was approved by referendum.
I do want to just point out, because however I said it was interpreted differently, then I apologize. I certainly wasn't intending to say that 7 to 10% is anything that we should be, setting our sights on. What I'm saying is that we are substantially less than that now. If you take the municipal piece of the budget, the $21-ish million, the 700,000 represents about 3%. If you take our bottom line, which is frankly what a lot of towns would do to calculate this percentage, it's like 1 or 2% or something. I definitely don't want you to interpret what I was saying, Mr. Freudman, that 7 or 10% is a direction that I'm proposing the town go. I was just merely pointing out that the range that is sort of, I don't want to say universally recognized, but widely recognized as being a healthy range. We are sort of an order of magnitude less than that, and we should feel pretty good about where we are now. Not saying that future increases should be taken flippantly or shouldn't be controlled or shouldn't be cause for concern. I'm just saying that even when you look at what was already taken on as additional debt a couple years ago, and thank you for pointing out that this year's budget doesn't really grow it much further. It's just in a continuation of existing obligations. That was the only point I was trying to make.
Yeah, but it's the lull before the storm. I'll move on. And Mayor, I would appreciate you letting me ask my questions the way I wish to without interruption. Thank you. Again, I don't want to get into the weeds too much now, but something about support for the community center, which I think this fiscal year was $906,000 just from the operating budget, transfer from the general fund to the operating budget, not counting capital expenses at that building. Now, I realize that some of that money, which was an amount that was added towards the end, that hole was plugged by taking interest income. And somehow you said something about that money from interest income. Somehow that wasn't going to count as a burden on the town because you're using it for interest income. That loses me completely. That interest income should just be treated like that sliver that you showed of sources of revenue, where some mainly comes from taxes, some from intergovernment, and then some from other things like fees or interest income. That should just be thrown into the general fund like everything else. And who cares? Well, I do care, but whether it's used for salaries, benefits, or whatever, but to earmark it for something so that you can then rationalize that the community center wasn't subsidized to the degree it was, that concerns me as I don't want to use too strong language. It almost seems like it's something that's being used to, I don't know, subsume something, make it look like that money didn't really count because we used interest income just for that. That seems to me.
Mr. Freudman, let's get a clarification. Ms. Ryan, did you say anything about using interest income for the community center?
I don't believe I did, then.
Well,
what I believe, Ms. David, what I believe he said was that certain costs in the capital fund were not going to come out of the town's budget, but out of the Parks and Rec budget. That was the only reference to the community center that I recall.
okay. Now I do have one question, but I'm not asking for an answer on the spot. I know we could certainly wait till we're discussing the capital budget in greater detail, which I think is tomorrow night. I'm not sure, but I noticed there was $115,000 for parking garage repairs. What for? We're just spending $64,000 this year just for new lighting there. What is it now? I don't mean, if you don't know, we can discuss that when that's on the agenda for detail.
But that'll definitely be discussed. It does come from a different source of funding. It comes from the transit fund, but it will be discussed and broken out for you in a subsequent meeting. I guess without hopefully confusing the matter further, I do want to revisit the comments I made about the interest income. So again, just to be as clear as I hopefully can be, interest income does indeed go into it's another form of revenue that just goes into the general fund, much the way you said you hoped it would be. That is exactly the case. The revenue in the general fund really, while there's a lot of different sources, it's sort of three different buckets. There's money from taxes, there's money from intergovernmental sources, i.e. pilot funds and ECS, the state cost share funds. And then there's, quote, other revenue. And that's often, almost always the smallest source of revenue, but it's things like your building permits and land use fees and on down a litany of things, and would include the interest income. And so the interest income, only point I was trying to make is from last budget year to this budget year, we've seen a $350,000 drop off in interest income. So basically the general fund lost $350,000 of interest income because the total amount collected in interest, dropped from about $400,000 to about $50,000. So there's no link at all, and anything I just said, there's absolutely no link at all to Parks and Rec.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sam?
Hi, thank you, and I really appreciate the effort and time everyone took, you, Ryan, to present that and get everything together for us. And maybe I misunderstood, and I think what Ben was asking kind of alerted me to this. If we're assuming sorry, I'm using a gray pen, so I have to, the ARP funds, our mill rate as it stands would go down.
It would not go down. The amount of increase, instead of being 0.79,
Okay.
would
Yeah.
be 0.49. It would be 30 cents per thousand less.
Okay. And with the ARP funds, with us not knowing until May, is there, I mean, we have a general, it sounds like we have a general idea of how much that will be, but we won't know 100% sure until then. Is that what is that what you said?
Yeah, so they're very well, I guess, a few different possibilities. One, the one thing we keep talking about that I've used as an example, the interest income, we could find out that for one reason or another, that isn't actually recoverable. It's not eligible to be recovered. I don't think that's going to be the case based on everything people keep saying. But for argument's sake, if that's not the case, then that comes off the table. Right now, I use that as an example because that's the one area of general operations revenue that I feel pretty confident, like in a meaningful amount. There's other small dollar things, which could add up to being a fair amount in the end. But like as an example, some towns, their land use fees, their building permits, just the rates of, projects and stuff, really dropped off. Others didn't see any decrease. Others saw an increase because people weren't working. They're going to do that, build that new garage they've been thinking about all these years. So like for us here, we did not see a drop off. Our building department did, pretty well over the past year. Rates of new projects, didn't really see a dip. So there, all the different categories of things that we believe would be eligible in terms of lost revenue. And this is a good thing, good news for us. We didn't experience as much of a drop off. So I think the things that we can look at and scrutinize and say, is this eligible? For us, it's a shorter list of things. And as far as I know now, and we're going to continue to look at things, but as far as I know now, that interest income loss is by far and away the biggest ticket item that would really move the needle on the mill rate in a meaningful way.
Ron?
Thank you.
Thank you for this presentation, and I look forward to looking at it in more detail. Just to grossly oversimplify, basic question. Is there any current activity that the town is undertaking that you recommend stop? And is there anything that is in this budget that is a new activity that the town has not undertaken thus far?
Great question. Obviously, there are a lot of new things. So capital projects being kind of one and done things, that's sort of a separate, I guess, discussion. But in terms of programs and services, it really is a continuation of the services we're providing. Relatively nominal changes in service delivery, nothing really dramatic. And if with your indulgence, I'd be happy to think about this a bit more and come back, make sure I'm not missing anything. But, I don't think when you think about it in the aggregate across all departments that anything is really changing in a sort of major, way that should be reported. It really is a continuation of current service. In terms of, stopping things that we do, it doesn't necessarily have a lot of that either. The one thing I guess I would, just point out, without being too specific or predetermining any outcomes, because we don't know what the outcomes will be, I would just point out that, we do have multiple CBAs, multiple collective bargaining agreements that are coming up for renewal here with the July 1, restart date. So, that can have noteworthy implications in terms of the town budget, moving the needle in any number of ways, depending on how those negotiations go. And so I'm not saying that the outcome of that is known. I would just point out that, when we budget now, not necessarily knowing, we don't have a crystal ball exactly how things are going to shake out. So you have to have some buffer in your contingencies for various ways that those scenarios could play out.
Thank you.
Terry?
I'm admittedly jumping ahead a little bit here, and I apologize for that. I also want to thank Ryan and the entire team for doing such a fantastic job. It was a wonderful presentation. It was very easy to follow. Clearly, a lot of thought went into it, and that really, budgets are hard. And I know they're hard for you to do, but they're hard. Not being necessarily a math person, it takes a lot of work to explain to somebody like me what it all means, and I felt like I could really follow that, so that was super helpful. One thing I do care greatly about is sort of the human services. I care about money too, but the human services component of what we do. One thing I'm hoping to see in this budget, and sort of in terms of priorities, is this was before you started, Ryan, but last year before the budget process, we started a conversation about juvenile review boards, and I'm hoping to see some progress on that coming forward. And I'm certainly hoping to see some also work regarding transparency, because we're such a privileged community relative to some of our surrounding communities, that we have a thoughtful way of making sure that we're supporting the not-for-profit efforts going on in other communities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ben, followed by David.
Thanks. So I wanted to go back to the American Rescue Plan for just a second, and sort of ask two things. One is, we've obviously, just back to the community center in particular, but Parks and Recs and all of the different parts of Parks and Rec that generates revenue, like the summer camp and stuff that's not connected to the community center. As David pointed out earlier, we've already, eaten through our existing budget a very substantial revenue reduction in Parks and Rec this current fiscal year. I would imagine we are going to expect that to taper off, but that we would expect, at least for the first half of the next fiscal year, to see some reduction in that revenue. My question is sort of specific to the money we've already expended, or have already planned to expend in the current year, and frankly, even in last fiscal year, around that area of revenue. Is there an ability to expend retroactively ARP money to cover those expenses? And if so, does that give us then a significantly better budget picture to work with for the next fiscal year?
So the short answer, I believe, is yes. These are rough numbers. When I wrote these down, they're also about a month old. So our projected year-end revenues, like for the current budget year for recreation, may be a bit different. But whenever I wrote this down, which again was several weeks ago now, I made the note that I believe that upwards of $1.3 million of revenue shortfall in recreation this year, FY 2021, would be recoverable. That's based on projected year-end revenue of something like 1.14 million against last year's, the FY 1920's actuals of 2.4 million. So 1.3 million, I believe, would be recoverable. We could make ourselves whole for the current budget year. And then to your point about lingering effects for the next budget year, the budget year that's been the focus of tonight's discussion, we're projecting it's quite a bit of a bounce back from this year's actuals, but it's still falling short of the FY 19/20 actual revenues of 2.4 million. So we're budgeting for revenues in FY 21/22 of about 2.16 million. So that's about a $250,000 under our baseline year. So for this year, I believe we would have $1.3 million eligible that we could recover. And I believe next year, based on what we've budgeted, around $250,000 if actual revenues match up with what we've budgeted. We can't collect in advance based on what we're showing as a budget. It would be if the actual revenue experience was consistent with how we're budgeting now. It looks like it would be about $250,000.
And so just as a much broader follow-up then, that's very helpful. Just sort of back of the envelope calculations, you mentioned about, call it $1.25 million in existing losses in Parks and Rec, adding $250,000 in next year as an anticipated loss, that gets you to 1.5 plus about 350 in interest income. You're no matter how many things you add into that number, we're way south of $7.5 million of direct COVID impact on Mansfield municipal budget general fund. And so my question is a process question, and maybe it's something we need to decide as a council, but I'm, obviously curious for your input, which is how do you see us addressing how to spend, creating a spending plan for the remainder of the ARP dollars that are not, that we're not going to be able to directly attribute to COVID related revenue loss to the general fund. Do you anticipate us doing that as part of this budget process, which we aren't required to do since they will not technically be, money spent from tax revenue along this timeline, or do you require us do you expect that we would do it in a different way and separate from this process? Because I think the answer probably impacts how we choose to adjust this budget and its associated change to the mill rate.
Sure. I see there being some interplay between the two, but if you're kind of asking me to pick a discrete answer here, I would say that it's a separate process that's playing out largely in parallel fashion. So this is that prioritization exercise you've alluded to. That's not something that would be done only after the dust settles on this year's budget. But it also, I think we could confuse the matter if we make it part and parcel with the budget discussion. I think there are some things, particularly like as it relates to, if we have a project that's on the CIP list to be funded this year, that once these guidelines are out becomes very clear, it's like if it's squarely in the guidelines, we could say, well, hey, we can pull that off of capital non-recurring and we can fund that project with ARP. That's good news. And then specific things, like I keep going back to the interest income, we may make an adjustment there. But I think prioritizations are really important. We've been doing this and talking about this at a staff and department head level for a little bit now. What I would like to do is sort of next steps is have a little bit more focused group discussion, which we haven't really done yet, with my management team, come up with, a relatively comprehensive list of possibilities. And I'll have to think about the right way to proceed with this. But, once we have a relatively robust working list of options and we maybe then internally have looked over things and some things have been cast aside. So we have a relatively robust, but also a manageable list of options, and sort of an internal working sort of prioritization, if you will, coming out of that. Then bring that to the council for your deliberation and feedback. But I see that happening in the not too distant future and before the budget process is completed.
Thanks. That's helpful. And I asked partially to sort of point out to the question or point Terry just raised, that in addition to funding various aspects of town government that are, allowable expenses, the ARP does also give municipalities specific authority to do a heck of a lot of interesting and frankly revolutionary things with federal dollars that we haven't, as a municipal government in Connecticut, really ever been able to do or haven't in a very long time. We are as I understand it, at least, there are two allowable expenses that are quite interesting. One is to use the money directly to provide grants to local organizations, and so to be a grantor of federal dollars, essentially. And the second one is actually, if I'm not mistaken, to provide direct payments to first responders. That provision of the bill that passed the House back in April, the House Democrats bill that never got anywhere, still didn't get anywhere, except they've allowed municipalities to provide what they called heroes pay for their work as essential workers during COVID, up to $25,000 per year per person, which obviously we wouldn't be able to afford to do in total. But just to give a sense for how broad our outside of municipal revenue expenditures ability to use this money might be, and how different our thinking as a council is going to have to be to figure out how we can spend all of it.
I would just say real quick, you're right. I meant to actually bring something earlier, a comment earlier back to that, and then we got away from it. But to Terry's point, absolutely, their eligible uses extend to providing direct financial support to civic organizations, nonprofit organizations, human service organizations that we believe in, and so those are all discussions that need to be part of the deliberative process, just as any discussions and thought process would need to be done again in group as far as small business support that we might want to provide.
Mr. Freudman, David.
Yeah, a few things. I'm glad Ben mentioned something I had said about the community center. And yes, we used the closeout for fiscal 20 to bring the transfer from the operating fund to the community center to up to 906,000. I just want to point out, yes, for this year, Sherry estimated last summer that it would be 745,000 for this fiscal year, but alas, she was not projecting that would go down for fiscal 22. She was projecting 804,000. Of course, we'll have to wait to see the budget book and be discussing that to see what it is, but there's still a lot of rough times ahead. One other thing, since Terry mentioned a hope that she had about something, I think it was a juvenile review board, I'd like to mention a hope I have. You mentioned, Ryan, contingency for the two upcoming collective bargaining agreements, Public Works and Professional and Technical. You are absolutely right to be including some contingencies in there, but I feel the contingencies that are proper are for things like step increases and benefit increase in cost and benefits that the town pays. I would not reward the collective bargaining units for not coming to us in a timely way to renegotiate those contracts. So I don't feel at all, I could not support your putting any contingency in for general wage increase. Just my opinion.
Dan?
Sorry, I just wanted to know, is there any room in the budget for the tooth fairy? My 9-year-old just lost his tooth as we were sitting here, and I'm like, go! I didn't understand it, so no, I'm just kidding. But he really did lose his tooth.
I'll double check the eligible uses and get back to you.
I have a couple of questions, Ryan. We've got this really significant increase in healthcare costs, and I'm wondering whether any of that is related to COVID.
Yeah, so and I don't have the document in front of me, but I believe in the case of our renewal, if memory serves correct, and forgive me, Mayor, I don't know if you were part of the Finance Committee meeting when we gotten the white paper from Tim Hasselman with Lockton, but had it not been for COVID, I think the renewal rate would have been somewhere like in the 5 to 7, 8 range. But there was an 11% adjustment that Anthem sort of layered on the top of everything. That was specifically a COVID-19 impact. The assumption being that a lot of elective procedures and things that people had put off, they didn't go to the hospital. They were steering clear of all that. That there's going to be making up for lost time, for lack of a better term. And so there is, I believe it's a 16% increase in premium, and somewhere around 11%, 10-11% of that is basically being driven by this COVID adjustment that Anthem has placed on top of it. So if it wasn't for that, it would be much more like 5%, but we're getting hit pretty hard.
That sounds like a very nice use of the ARP funds.
It'll definitely be explored. Yep.
Okay, and I have I wrote down 5 questions. I'm a little concerned about why we're continuing to invest in technology for the old schools when we're going to have a new school built. And I would just like to make sure that we get, that portion of our contribution as opposed to the school budget contribution. I would like to see a real justification for that. Also, in the ARP, there's money for essential employees. The heroes money that somebody was just talking about. Who would fall into that category among our employees?
I wouldn't want to misquote. I haven't, to be honest, that while I'm aware of that being an eligible area, it hasn't been something that we've studied or researched yet. So let me look into that further.
Okay, and finally, this is a more generalized question. This past year has had a lot of change, and people have been doing business in a much different way. And I'm wondering whether any of those experiences with delivery of services in different ways or delivery of different services is going to be reflected in permanent changes.
Well, I think so. There have been a lot of changes, or there were a lot of changes in terms of how the public, interacted with and received service. And so while that change has been pretty dramatic for a period of time, I think the other piece of this is while I'll use Town Hall as an example. Obviously, this is the case for a number of different municipal facilities. But while Town Hall has been, up till recently now with being open by appointment and looking at the next month, hopefully being able to open more fully, while Town Hall has been closed to the public in terms of people coming in off the street, the staff have been continuing largely to come to work and work in the same way. And so while there was for a period, again, when COVID was at its worst, more staff working kind of split schedules to not overlap and part of the team working remotely and part of the team being in the office and kind of flip-flopping. My sense, and this is anecdotal, this is not based on an empirical study or anything, but based on the feedback that I've received, I think a lot of people are really happy. And they might not have ever, would have thought they'd say this, but I think a lot of people are frankly happy to be back into a more normal coming and going, work environment. You can make do. And I think our team has done a tremendous job under very challenging circumstances, performing at a high level with, sort of a telework, flexi place work sort of arrangement. But I think a lot of people are very happy to have that behind them because, it does create a certain burden. It makes a lot of transactional things harder. The conversation that you'd have with somebody in passing, exchange really important information about 15 seconds time as you're literally passing in the hall. Now it becomes a planned phone call or an email, and everything, all that day-to-day stuff takes more time. While documents are digital, depending on the information somebody needs, if it's something that they need that's in the office and they're working at home, they don't have access to, again, you can build in some inefficiencies there. And we're a public facing organization. We want to be able to receive the public, and people that pay taxes, I think want to have the ability to walk through a door and talk to somebody. And so we're looking forward to largely a return to that. But I do think, in general, broad brush terms, I would say that there are things that probably will be forever changed in terms of, us continuing to offer something in a sort of quote touchless way for our residents that really are happy to be able to do that and would rather not come into Town Hall to do it.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? All right, well, I know that this has been a very difficult year for the leadership staff in Town Hall. I mean, there certainly has been a lot of change and a lot of learning, not to mention a pandemic. It would have been difficult without a pandemic, and with the pandemic, it made it even more tricky. And my own experience in working with the department heads over the past year has been that it is a remarkable bunch of people, and they're collaborative work and their support of one another has been truly remarkable over the past year. So I would also like to extend my thanks to all of the staff who's currently on this call and to the people who back them up in their offices in Town Hall. With that, do we have any public comment, Ryan?
I was not made aware of any public comment. No.
All right, then the next item on our agenda is a motion to adjourn. Do I hear such a motion? Moved by Ben, seconded by Charlie. All those in favor of adjourning, wave your hands. Good night, everybody.
Thank you all. We'll see you tomorrow.
Good night.
Tomorrow night.
Good night and thank you.